Now, the remarks I will present to you today are not something like a snapshot of my own recent research. Rather, I thought I should meditate for you out loud, present to you a number of rather straightforward propositions that I think should guide the study of identity, and in particular the study of Jewish identity and converso identity, or perhaps I should say identities. Let me start with one very simple proposition. Self-identity is not something that's passed on as if by magic from parents to children. Rather, it's something that I think is eminently historical. I'm a historian, so I think in historical terms. Specifically, identity is a combination that occurs over time of two clusters of factors. First, the subjective perceptions of an individual or a group of individuals, and on the other hand, facts, including other perceptions, that lay outside of the individual, lay beyond the group. To illustrate this, let me give you a fictitious scenario. Let's say that I think of myself as an electrician. And at the same time, there are genuine documents, not forgeries, but well-validated documents that describe me as an electrician. There are individuals and there are organizations of electricians and non-electricians who regard me as an electrician. Moreover, my actual experiences as a practitioner of the electrical trade, let's say my concrete application of particular skills to problems of wiring and short circuits and so forth, all these things don't only reside between my temples. Other people can see them, can hear them, can vouch for them. Most importantly, in this situation, I know what the specific occupational group that I wish to belong to is all about. I know what it requires of me, and most, if not all, members of that particularistic group agree that I am in fact a member of the group in good standing. In this case, my subjectivity and the objective world outside of me, society, let's say, these things coincide. They align, by and large, on what it means to be an electrician. And therefore, they attach the definition that they share, electrician, to me, right? My consciousness and society, both. Now, what does this somewhat silly scenario have to do with the historicity, the historical study of Jews and New Christians, aka Judeo-conversos or Judeo-conversos? Let me answer this in stages. And I feel that God is speaking to me now. I forgot my kippah, so I may be in trouble here. As you probably know, history has yielded many abstract, supposedly definitive definitions of who and what a Jew is. For example, there exist a number of traditional rabbinic definitions, and they don't all concur. They apply to different specific, circumstances. But the most famous one, perhaps the one that has influenced the most Jewish communities since the 2nd century at least, is basically this. An Israelite is a person whose mother is an Israelite. It may also be a person who was not born to an Israelite mother, and yet this person has willingly joined or been adopted by the Israelite community in accordance with rabbinic law, specifically by undergoing certain prescribed rituals and a formal process of education and acculturation or naturalization, if you will. And incidentally, the term for this is giyur, which doesn't translate correctly as conversion. Something like dwelling with. And so when somebody becomes a dweller with Jews, then he or she is essentially adopted by the community. Now, needless to say, non-Jews have produced their own definitions of who and what is a Jew as well. For example, according to the church, in medieval and early modern Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, as well as other places, a Jew was a person who believed in and observed the ceremonies of, quote, the law of Moses. This is a phrase which may or may not be a translation of the Hebrew Torat Moshe, which is the teaching of Moses. At any rate, a Jew, according to this idea, was a person who believed that performing those ceremonies of the law of Moses would ensure the salvation of his or her soul. This, by the way, is how multiple inquisitorial documents talk about the supposed Jewishness of not only Jews, but of new Christians, whom, by the way, normally the inquisitors tended to blend into one another. I mean, they didn't distinguish between a judío and a judaizante, right? A person who behaves like a Jew in accordance with the church's own definition. By the same token, according to this definition, a Jew is a person who rejects the religion of Christians because that person, that Jew or Jewish individual, refuses to accept the revealed truth that Jesus is the Messiah, and that Christian faith and not the performance of works prescribed by the old law of the Old Testament is what ensures the salvation of the soul. Now, I'm simplifying, but just so you get the basic idea, okay? And let's leave aside for the moment that the Old Testament is not the Hebrew Bible. These are very different editions of some of the same works, but some works that are not the same. So this, what I've just sketched, is a normative Christian interpretation, but it's one that matters to us because in many ways it's been inherited by Western societies and is, in effect, you might say, all the way to the present day. According to this notion, Jews are people who profess something that the ancient Greeks, not the Judeans themselves, but the ancient Greeks named Judaismos, Judaism. By that term, the Greeks meant something like the way of life, meaning the language, the laws, the customs of the native Israelite people of the country called Judah, Yehudah. However, over the centuries, Christian theologians changed that meaning of Judaismos. By Judaism, they meant something like the theology, the rituals of God worship of the Jews. And since, according to St. Paul, the Jews were carnal, earthbound people, not a spiritual community like the Christians, this Judaism was a kind of inverted and dark mirror image of Christianity. Jews were thus culturally and morally like the evil twins of Christians, if you'll pardon the reference to soap operas. Jews were people of the wrong faith and therefore bound for perdition. Besides this religious definition, there are others that non-Jews have proposed over the centuries and about who and what is a Jew. For example, most of you are probably aware, if not all of you, that the notion of limpieza de sangre, or cleanness of blood, which dates back to the Castile of the late 1300s and to the mid-1400s, this notion had it that a Jew, or a Jewish person at any rate, is an individual, regardless of his or her formal religious, social, and political status, whose grandparents included at least one openly professing Jew, or, depending on the version of limpieza, one baptized grandparent who was known to descend from Jews. Other versions, perhaps the most popular versions of this notion of cleanness of blood, had it that they went beyond the proverbial cuatro costados, the four grandparents' families. They argued that having any ancestor who reputedly professed the law of Moses, no matter how distant the ancestor, rendered a person's blood infected. Sangre infecta was the preferred term. Now, in modern times, additional definitions have been proffered. For believers of 19th century pseudoscience, meaning junk science, the notion of infected blood becomes a secular concept. Modern racists have it that a Jew is a person who belongs to an alleged Semitic race and who therefore exhibits, or at least is likely to exhibit, very ugly physical characteristics, as well as a debased and debasing moral character. And this, by the way, is no matter what cultural identity the Jewish person claims for himself or herself, and no matter how he or she has actually behaved in the past. Now, according to this racist position, character and culture are conveyed by bodily fluids. Thus, for example, even a woman of absolutely no Jewish ancestry who has engaged in sexual contact with a Jewish man is racially impure and thus a kind of Jew, right? At least a tainted non-Jew. And here, in case you're wondering, I'm really paraphrasing the basic terms of the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Now here's another definition of Jews, what and who is a Jew. This one is a little bit more benign. It comes from the officials who have designed various recent versions of the US Census. According to them, a Jew is a person of whatever ancestry, who exhibits whatever behavior, from whatever social background, of whatever demonstrable opinions, who, when asked to declare his or her religion, simply marks a box that says Judaism or Jewish. Or, in the case of some variants of the census, actually writes that in. So according to this bureaucratic model, it's not ethnicity, not culture writ large, not ethnic nationality that makes a Jew, but rather something called religion. Notice, by the way, how close this bureaucratic American definition is to the medieval Christian definition. But also notice that here the subject's choice is everything, right? After all, the US is a country that enshrines the individual, the rugged individualist, the fellow with a cowboy hat riding off his horse into the sunset, declaiming, "Do your own thing, man." No one is there to compare what that person says about himself or herself for purposes of the census against any evidence. Now, what these rather abstract and value-laden definitions suggest to us, or where they lead me rather, is to offer you an alternative definition. And I'm going to present it as my second proposition. But before I do that, I have to acknowledge that, of course, everyone, popes, rabbis, ordinary people, anti-Semites, fellow Semites, whatever, everybody has the right, or if you prefer, the privilege, to decide what they think a Jew is, what Jewish culture is all about, and thus to say, so-and-so is Jewish, so-and-so is not Jewish. Marilyn Monroe, that's a Jew. Elvis Presley, that's a Jew. David Ben-Gurion, who didn't believe in God, that's not a Jew, and so on. Now, I'm a social and cultural historian, at least so I'm told by certain documents and by people who treat me seriously, or who pretend to treat me seriously, and I don't quite have the same privilege to say, oh yeah, this is Jew, this is not Jew, whatever. Why? Because I have to base my professional definitions not on my desires or my opinions alone, but on historical documents and verifiable data, which may or may not actually give me a clear picture of lived experience, of the lived experience of people who call themselves and who are called by others Jews. What I'm saying is that I can't only look at the prescriptive or normative discourses of individuals and institutions that are trying to create some sort of model of Jews and Judaism, a hard and fast standard which they want to compare, or with which they want to compare real people for their own purposes. So what is my second proposition, my alternative historical, you might say, definition of who is a Jew? Actually, you've already heard this definition. It's the definition I use to talk about the electrician who, number one, identifies as an electrician, is acknowledged as an electrician by most fellow electricians, and number three, is acknowledged as an electrician by non-electricians. Just plug in the word Jew instead of electrician. But wait, hold your horses. What about religion? Isn't it the fact that beliefs about God, beliefs about the soul, and rituals of God worship that are supposed to actualize these ideas, that these are the things that have historically made Jews? Isn't it true that Jews in, let's say, the 9th century were orthodox, were really well behaved, they kept kosher? They were told, don't go to this restaurant, and they fled from the restaurant. Yeah? Well, according to religious law, the religious law of traditional Jewish culture, the answer is no. As we already saw, what counts from the halachic point of view, from the Jewish legal point of view, is maternal ancestry or formal incorporation with a group, regardless of what a person believes, regardless of what the person does after his or her formal incorporation. Now, you may be a bad Jew by rabbinical standards if you don't observe halakha, Jewish law, but you don't cease to be a Jew. And by the way, my impression is that most Jews in history have been pretty mediocre Jews in terms of their observance. There's a beautiful book by David Malkiel of Hebrew University called Reconstructing Ashkenaz. There he surveys a number of rabbinic responsa, which are essentially jurists' answers to specific legal cases. And he shows that, among other things, medieval Ashkenazic Jews didn't do jack of what one would expect them to do. No talitot, no kippot, no mezuzot on the doors, no kashrut, and the rabbis are, of course, tearing their hair off, right? But this is reality, the classic gap between the ideal and the real. More importantly, on the basis of historical research, we can discover something even more crucial about what you might call the real life of Jews that isn't part of this rabbinic definition of Israel, of an Israelite. And that is that throughout the centuries, Jews have been Jews principally for two reasons. Number one, because they have been acculturated, they have been socialized within self-contained and self-sufficient Jewish communities. And of course, number two, they have lived within those communities. In other words, it's not the theology and the religious rituals per se that have imparted the Jews' cultural identity to them. After all, traditional Jewish life does not have even a term for religion. By the way, it has no term for prayer. When you say that a tefillah is a prayer, you're technically wrong. What we understand today in the West as Jewish religion was not called Judaism. And there was no sphere of Jewish experience on earth that Jews traditionally considered to be separate and somehow not subject to Jewish law. The notion of a duality between a secular sphere and a religious sphere or a spiritual sphere, that's a Western invention. It's a Greek invention that, among others, Paul of Tarsus decided to incorporate into his way of thinking. So, Jewish identity was not actually bestowed by Jews' blood either. Unless we want to throw away the natural sciences, which, we're welcome to do, we have to admit that people don't inherit cultural identity from their genes. What they inherit are things like Tay-Sachs disease, glucose intolerance, flat feet, grandpa's ears, and the like. If physical characteristics were actually key to the definition of Jewish studies, if it were clear that Jews identify each other because of the length of their pinkies, it'd be one thing. But that's not the case. So we can kind of put DNA aside. Okay, so what was it? What actually made Jews Jewish in real life? As I said before, it was a strong sociological scaffolding. It was the circumstances that attended to living as a self-recognized and universally recognized kehillah, an internally autonomous polity or community, one based on Jewish ethnicity. That's how Jews lived for over 3,000 years until the French Revolution and the modern era of political emancipation and assimilation. Notice what's absent here. Tikkun olam, a favorite of American Jews. Many of them treat it as though that's the point of Judaism. And I say, go ahead, do it. It's great. It's lovely. It's not one of the 613 commandments. It means something very different in Kabbalah, in jurisprudence, than it does to American Jews. That's just, The point here is that Jews constituted themselves as a people. This only raises a question. What's ethnicity? And to answer that question, I often rely on the definition that's been provided by the anthropologists John Hutchinson and Anthony Smith. By the way, they don't study Jews, they study Irishmen and others, but I think the definition is a good one. So let me offer it to you as as something like an anchor. So these two guys define an ethnic group as a network of people who exhibit 6 main features. First, a common proper name or names. Names like Israel, Beit Israel, Am Israel, Beit Yaakov. Okay? Second, narratives that explain the common ancestry of the group and proffer a perception of kinship among the group's members, such that they learn to feel that they form part of a super family. Not a family that wears red capes, but a family that is extended, that goes from the past through the present and into the future. By the way, why didn't anybody laugh at my joke about red capes? I mean, I'm trying to entertain you here. Please do, you have to humor me a little bit. Third factor, historical memories. Yeah, not necessarily what happened to the group, because that's a matter of historicity. Rather, what the group chooses to remember or to remember and how it chooses to remember. Fourth, elements of a common culture, usually but not necessarily including such aspects as language, customs, ideas about the transcendent, what lies beyond, rites of passage, and so on. Fifth, a link with a homeland. This is usually articulated as a symbolic attachment when the ethnic group doesn't actually occupy that place. So, for example, Armenians may have very fond stories that they tell each other about Armenia, even though they've never, because they're exiles, they've never lived there, some of them. Of course, Sephardim as a sub-ethnic groups have cultivated for centuries interesting knowledge about Iberia, about Castile, about Portugal, and so forth, even though they, since 1492, they haven't been there. Sixth, a sense of solidarity on the part of at least some sections of the ethnic population. So those are the 6 factors. Notice that all these aspects are eminently transmittable. I hazard, however, that they are more likely to stick, so to say. They're more likely to be absorbed and transmitted from generation to generation when they are learned within largish, internally oriented social cohorts, rather than, say, within a lone family or in a relationship between 2 individuals. And the reason that I think of these 2 alternate examples is that I've read a number of inquisitorial records, and according to many of the testimonies found there, at least some conversos claim that they had been specially initiated into the family's Judaism, in a hallway, or by suddenly being introduced to a long-lost uncle or aunt who knew what it meant to believe in the law of Moses or some such. Obviously, it's more difficult to transmit a culture that's being presented in that way than if the culture is sort of, available to you no matter what you do. I've interviewed, by the way, a number of young American Jews who, on the question of how they conceive of their own ethnicity, and it's very clear to me that those who have gone to Israel have something like a eureka moment, because they realize that everything around them is quote-unquote Jewish. Their toothbrush is Jewish, the street signs are Jewish, the bus driver is Jewish. I mean, this may or may not be the case, right? The Israelis aren't just Jewish, 20% Arabs. But the point is that there is a sense of the publicity of the identity. The outside world ratifies the inner conception. Now, as I mentioned before, historically Jews developed as a nation in antiquity. They didn't call themselves an ethnic group. These are modern scientific terms. But what I mean to say is that the social group was not by any means a secret society. It was a public body. It developed its own distinctive public communalist culture. That culture included, and it still includes, various ideas about the transcendent and various practical modes of separating the transcendent from the finite, or as some people like to say, the holy from the profane. So there's no, God and Caesar and no heaven and earth. These things are not quite that separate for Jews traditionally, but there is the holy and the profane. I'm going to be provocative. I'm going to tell you that Jews did not develop as a community of faith or as a religion in the Western sense of the term. In other words, they didn't develop as a group that was constituted by its members' inner convictions and their acceptance of certain theological propositions and certain rites of worship. Now, some of you may be saying, well, what about Maimonides' 13 articles of Jewish faith? The prayer, Ani Ma'amin. How many know the Ani Ma'amin, by the way? Wow. Okay. Good for you. I have a letter to write to your rabbi. Of course, I'm assuming that everybody here is Jewish because, hey, isn't everybody Jewish? Just joking. At any rate, you don't have anything to fear from me, okay? I'm as lax as the next person. The point is that Jews don't have a religion in traditional terms. At the foot of Mount Sinai, they're depicted in the Hebrew Bible as a group, the Israelites, Bnei Israel, right? And they, they're given law, and they respond, we will do and we will listen, right? They don't respond, we believe. On the basis of our considerations, of our deliberations, we have determined that indeed this is the truth. No, okay? It's very straightforward, very practical. Let's just do it, right? This is our law. And it's not a matter of debate. It's a fact. It's a historical fact. Just as redemption is going to take place as a historical fact. It's not going to happen in some, faraway realm. It's going to happen in the land of Israel. All the exiles will be ingathered. A temple will be rebuilt, or will descend from the heavens on a crane, and there'll be a Jewish king. Now, you may ask, where does all of this leave Judeo-conversos, most of whom historically did not have and had not formed part of Jewish communities unless, for example, they emigrated from Iberian realms, like the parents of the philosopher Benedict Spinoza, and they formally joined, or informally joined, existing Jewish communities, or created new Jewish communities of their own. Where does this leave conversos who may have practiced secret rituals in order to distinguish themselves from other Christians, but who didn't have an experience, a lived experience, of living in a kehillah? Well, I think we can certainly speak of new Christian beliefs and ceremonies that varied from normative Iberian Christianity. We can speak of new Christian dissidents who were trying to reject the precepts and ceremonies of the church by consciously adhering not to a Jewish model of Jewishness, but to the church's picture of Judaism. Sometimes they did this by combining or cobbling together scant information about this Judaism from sources as diverse as anti-Jewish treatises and the Christian Old Testament in Latin. So, for example, I think we can speak in late 16th, 17th centuries, we can speak of a biblicist anti-Catholicism among new Christians. Now, this is to be distinguished, for example, from the practices of alleged Judaizers, or you might say, or real Judaizers in the early 16th century. Why? Because some of these people actually remembered what it was to live publicly as a Jew. They had more information. They were closer to the wellsprings of Jewish culture. And here, all I'm doing is underscoring the historian's favorite questions. Where and when? Yeah? If you issue totalizing definitions about who's who and what's what, you pretty soon lose sight of the times and the places where people actually live. Yeah? So a Judaizer in 1492, right, is different from a Judaizer in 1710. We can't speak of one, blob of conversos who all think the same things and all do the same things. Okay. I would argue that because the traditional life of Jews, their lived experience of Jewish culture for over 3,000 years, was and is at base public, collective, and practical in its emphases, the very notion of Crypto-Judaism, of a secret Judaism, a secret culture worthy of the name Jewish is itself questionable. I think that the most that we can assert on empirical grounds about converso patterns of dissident religiosity in the Iberian Peninsula and perhaps in the American Southwest, although I'm not familiar with that territory, is that the connection of these so-called new Christians to Jews and to Jewish culture was and has been largely figural. Figural because it either completely lacks or virtually lacks any real correspondence to Jewish communal life as the vast majority of Jews have lived it. But this only brings me to my last proposition, which some of you may welcome as the good news. And this I said the last time I came to Santa Fe. It's nice to repeat it here. This is a proposition. Fortunately, or unfortunately, at any rate, historicity, the historicity of an identity, is not the same thing as its authenticity. Let me put it very differently. Don't ask historians and other scholars to tell you who you really are. Don't ask them to prove that the self-image you have of yourself, the self-image you have or desire, is attested to in the archives. It may or may not be attested to in the archives. The historical documents are often not that transparent anyway. And I can tell you that from years of studying inquisitorial stuff. Let's say, for example, that you find that your distant ancestor was burned in Mexico City as a result of a conviction of Crypto-Judaism or Judaizing. Does that mean that that person was a Judaizer? We know what the Holy Office determined, but the tribunals did not conform to anything we would call due process. It's, for example, akin to believing if we say that the Inquisition is right, then we have to also believe, let's say, the Iranian regime when it tells us that it has captured some Israeli spies among Iranian Jews. It's conceivable that the Mossad, recruited some Iranian Jews to do its work. It's also possible that the Iranian Secret Service is just trying to find Jews under the cupboards. Jews, bad Jews, Zionists, evil people, right? How much credence you give to authoritarian systems, authoritarian tribunals, is your choice, of course. But I would say, beware. At any rate, historical documents that prove who you think you are may not be available. In any case, even if the documents are there somehow, it's not the job of scholars to validate you or to invalidate you. We basically set our own agenda for examining reality and trying to analyze it such that people of different opinions, different backgrounds, different proclivities, may accept what we unearth and explain that is provable. We're not, for example, private genealogists. We are not, therefore, going to be anybody's ally, anybody's oppressor, anyone's gatekeeper in front of the beautiful mansion of Jewish peoplehood. The good news is that no one but you and the collective traditionally known as Am Israel, the people Israel, in your relationship with one another, none but you and Am Israel control if and how you relate to Jewish culture as it exists today. Historicity, which is, if you will, my Geschäft, my business, is about yesterday. Authenticity, the authenticity of an identity, is about now. I suspect that if you genuinely wish to be part of the Jewish nation, you must engage it, right? That's not so much a statement of scholarly observation as much as a piece of unsolicited advice. So this is the electrician's third option. Engage constructively with a group that you seek to be part of and whose culture you seek to own. Because it is in this intersection of self and community, of our inner world and the outer social world that we wish to inhabit, that we go from a kind of, painful yearning and a great degree of navel-gazing. We go from that to the experience of social becoming. I think Stan Hordes has done a wonderful job of making these questions evident and has grounded them in historical research. And for that, I thank Stan. Thank you.